You were never meant to hear this. In fact, there are those who'd burn this footage just for existing. But you're here now, and that means something inside you is ready to remember. So listen closely. In 1847, in the black lungs of the Appalachian fog, there was a village that disappeared, not by war, not by fire, but by something older, something darker. Its name was Black Hollow. No road signs ever pointed there. No maps marked its soil. It was the kind of place you didn't find by accident. You either wandered there through madness or were summoned. And the people of Black Hollow, they weren't like you and me. No, they carried out a ritual no outsider could explain. Every time one of them died, they were buried. And then, 3 nights later, they were buried again. 2 funerals, 2 graves, 2 coffins. Not a mistake, not a superstition. A commandment, unwritten, unspoken, but ironclad. Even the priest sent to investigate the town, Father Albin Travers, couldn't understand what he saw. He was sent to serve God, but what he found belonged to something else. He arrived through mud-choked hills, 3 days on horseback. But when he crossed the wooden sign etched with a name already fading, it wasn't a welcome he received. It was retreat. Curtains drawn, doors locked, faces hidden. Except for one child. One boy, no more than 10, whispered to him, "You're just in time. We're about to do it again." That phrase alone would have been enough to send most men galloping back through the mist. But Travers stayed. He stayed because the village had that power, the kind that doesn't beg you to come, but dares you to leave. He witnessed the burial of Agnes Fairburn, a woman claimed by age. A quiet ceremony, as proper as any. But then, on the 3rd night, something happened that no church ever taught. The bells rang again, at midnight, and this time there were no hymns, only a siren, sea so thick it seemed to swallow the ground whole. A second casket, a second hole, the same body, or maybe not quite the same, lowered into earth already cursed. They chanted, not in Latin, not in English, but in something older, something that made the priest's blood freeze like winter glass. And when he asked the village elder why, the man simply said, "We do what we must. We've always done it this way." Now ask yourself, why would a village bury its dead twice? To stop something from rising, to silence a voice that refused to die, or to satisfy something watching from beneath? This wasn't folklore, this was documented. Travers kept journals, meticulous, terrified notes hidden behind the altar of a burned-out church hundreds of miles away. He wrote of chains around the dead, tar-sealed coffins, and mouths sewn shut. He wrote of people who returned after being seen dead, walking, eyes black, hands twitching as if they'd forgotten how to be human. One girl, Martha Blackwood, was buried after a fever, but 2 nights later, a hunter saw her, staring at him from the ridgeline, her mouth stitched closed, her eyes glassy and inhuman, and yet she breathed. This isn't just a story, this is a warning. There are places that were erased, not because they held no value, but because they remembered too much. Black Hollow wasn't lost. It was removed, scrubbed from record, cut out like rot from a tree, because it understood something we were forced to forget, that some deaths don't stick, and some soil refuses to sleep. And maybe, just maybe, you felt it before too. A moment alone at night, when the silence changes pitch. A grave you swore looked different the second time. The itch that someone, or something, is watching you from the tree line. This is not paranoia. It's memory clawing its way back. And if you're still here listening, you've already heard too much, but it's too late to stop. Because we're just beginning. The ground remembers, and the truth, it doesn't want to stay buried. They called it the cleansing rite, but it wasn't clean. And it wasn't a rite, not in the holy sense. It was older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than even the tongues that dared whisper it in caves before language wore clothes. Father Travers found it in a crumbling ledger buried beneath the chapel floor. Latin, yes, but with phrases even Latin feared to claim. Words like resurgere sine voluntate, to rise without will, and memoria obligata, memory bound in chains. These weren't metaphors, these were instructions, rituals, a protocol for death that refused to stay dead. Every second burial followed this code. No exceptions. Infants, soldiers, suicides. All were committed twice to the earth. The first time with love, the second time with fear. The villagers never explained. They couldn't. Not because they didn't want to, but because whatever governed Black Hollow wouldn't let them. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was enforcement. The gravedigger, Jonas Pike, had been digging holes for 50 years. He told Father Travers in a voice cracked like a split tombstone, "They move sometimes, not much, but just enough to let you know they ain't settled." He wept when he said it, not out of fear, out of guilt. He didn't bury the dead, he imprisoned them. Now, pause. Ask yourself, what kind of place breeds a ritual like that? A ritual so strict, so sacred, that even the mention of change brings dread. You're not dealing with folklore. You're looking at a map, one that leads not to a location, but to a state of awareness most men never reach. Because Black Hollow remembered something we've all forgotten. That death isn't a door, it's a negotiation, a pact. One that must be honored not once but twice, to make sure the thing that left the body doesn't change its mind. And if you think that sounds insane, consider this. In 1847, the surrounding counties recorded an unusual number of vanishings. Hunters, surveyors, vagabonds, all last seen near the woods beyond Black Hollow. None found, no bodies, no remains, just rumors, whispers of figures in the mist, sometimes with eyes glowing like coals, sometimes with no eyes at all. Travers noted in his journal, "I found a child's grave yesterday, fresh. The name was Abigail Wren, a ribbon still tied to the post, but next to it, a second grave. Same size, same name, same date. One had flowers, the other had salt. Salt, the ancient barrier, used by cultures worldwide to repel the unholy. So why would a Christian village resort to pagan protection? Because Christianity wasn't strong enough here, not for what Black Hollow had unearthed, not for what it had tried to suppress. The second burials weren't acts of mourning, they were acts of warfare, defensive strikes against an enemy that didn't bleed, didn't breathe, but remembered, because that's the real enemy, isn't it? Memory, especially the kind that was never yours to begin with. And what if I told you that memory wasn't trapped in the minds of men, but in the land itself? What if trauma could imprint on the soil? What if blood didn't just stain, it called back? That's what Black Hollow became, a wound that scabbed, but never healed. You see, it's not the dead you should fear, it's what clings to them, what follows them out of the body like steam, waiting, listening. And when the ritual isn't done right, when the second burial is skipped or faked or rushed, it doesn't just take the body, it claims the town. And that's why in 1852 the village vanished, not destroyed, not deserted, claimed. No census, no graves, no survivors, just one wooden journal found behind a scorched altar. Pages stuck together with wax and sweat and fear. You think this is just one story? No. Black Hollow is a template. There are others, places erased. Turns buried under bureaucracy and disbelief, but tonight, one of them reached you. And you need to decide now, before we go deeper, whether you're ready to keep remembering. The deeper you go, the harder it is to return. That's not a threat. It's a law, not of man, but of awareness, because truth doesn't set you free. It binds you, cuts away the comforts you thought were reality. And now that you've glimpsed it, the descent begins. You're not watching a video anymore. You're standing at the edge of something buried, and it's waiting to be uncovered. After weeks of silence and fear, Father Travers made a mistake. He asked too many questions, not to the villagers, but to the land. He began walking the perimeter of the cemetery every night, counting the graves, measuring the distance between the original plot and the second, and one night he realized something unholy. They were never buried in the same ground. The second graves were always just outside the old church's reach, outside consecrated land, outside protection. That was no coincidence, that was deliberate. The first burial was for appearances, for God. The second, for something else, something the villagers feared more than judgment. He tried to map the pattern, but it didn't fit geometry. It fit geometry inverted. The second graves formed a circle, but warped, crooked, leaning inward like a sinkhole, a spiral that drew toward a single point. The oldest grave in Black Hollow. A grave so old the name had faded from stone and memory alike. But Travers found it, because it wasn't marked by a cross. It was marked by a door. Not a real door, not wood or iron, but a carving, etched in the stone with angles that hurt to look at. A frame, a symbol, and below it one word barely legible, Endura. That word doesn't exist in Latin, but it did exist in a Gnostic dialect, whispered by Cathar heretics before the Inquisition silenced them. It meant to escape the prison of flesh, not by death, but by dying twice. Do you see it now? Black Hollow wasn't hiding death, it was managing a leak, a rupture in the veil, a hole through which something was trying to return, and those double burials, they weren't a rite, they were containment. And yet even that wasn't enough, because something had already escaped. Father Travers began hearing sounds beneath the floorboards of the church. Scratching, not like rats, but like fingernails on stone, whispers in the chapel long after everyone left. And always, the smell. Earth, wet, bitter earth. The kind of soil that doesn't just bury bodies, it absorbs them. He wrote, "I do not dream anymore. I remember things I have never lived. A woman burning, a child tied to a tree, bells that ring beneath the ground. These weren't dreams. These were inherited memories, echoes of the first incident, whatever it was, that poisoned the land. And you must understand this, it was never about superstition, it was about containment. Fear built the ritual, not faith. But the ritual required obedience, absolute, generational obedience. And that kind of obedience? It has a price. Especially when one person decides not to pay it. That person was Elias Wren's son, Samuel. He didn't believe. He called the second burial barbaric, said it shamed the dead, that they deserved peace, not paranoia. And so, when his own mother passed, he refused the second rite. He buried her once, and that was it. 3 nights later, half the goats in Black Hollow were found dead. Torn open, but not eaten. The villagers said nothing. No one confronted Samuel. They simply stopped looking at him, as if he were already gone. And then, 1 week later, Father Travers saw her. Agnes Wren, dead for 10 days. Standing in the church doorway at midnight, her eyes wide, her skin moving, as though something underneath was trying to remember how to wear it. She didn't speak. She only stared. And slowly, she raised one hand and pointed, not at Travers, but at the altar, at the stone beneath it, the place where the journal would one day be found. She was a message. And now, so is this. You're hearing all this for a reason, not curiosity, not coincidence. You were meant to, and if you feel a tightening in your chest, a flicker behind your eyes, it means you already know this isn't just about the past. We're still burying things wrong. We're still letting them out. There is a reason the second grave is dug in silence. No prayers, no music, no final goodbyes, only the sound of soil opening up like a wound that never healed right. Because that moment isn't about farewell, it's about negotiation, bargaining with forces older than our books, older than our bones. It's not grief they're afraid of in Black Hollow, it's recognition. Recognition from something watching through the seams of reality, for a soul that didn't cross over clean. Samuel Wren thought he could resist it, thought that tradition was weakness, that fear was for the backward and the broken. But what he didn't understand, And what most men never do is that some rituals aren't about belief, they're about containment. And when you violate that containment, you break the contract, not just with your ancestors, but with the thing they were trying to keep asleep. The villagers didn't punish Samuel, the land did. First came the silence. His name vanished from lips like a curse lifted by fire. No one knocked on his door, no one looked him in the eye. It was as if, by denying the second burial, he had become unclean, a spiritual contagion. Then the insects came, swarms that choked his livestock, clung to windows, poured from cracks in the floor. Travers saw it himself, flies that refused to die, even when burned, like they were sent, not born. Then the dreams started again, only they weren't dreams, they were intrusions. Father Travers wrote, "I feel them walking the halls, not ghosts, those I would welcome. These are fragments, feelings without bodies, faces without names, presences that do not belong in the waking world." He began to suspect the truth, that Black Hollow wasn't the origin, it was a plug, a cork in a bottle holding back something deeper, something that leaked into our world when people stopped listening, when men like Samuel chose pride over protocol. And the deeper he looked, the more he found signs that the corruption wasn't contained to the village. There were symbols carved into rocks 10 miles from the town, charcoal sketches in abandoned cabins, old miners' journals that spoke of tunnels that whisper back, and at the center of it all, the door. That damn carved door. It began appearing in his mind, not in dreams, but in waking flashes. The same frame etched into gravestones, the same angles, wrong, impossible angles that seemed to bend thought. And always that same word, endura. Travers believed, no, knew, that this was more than a ritual. It was a system. A psychological architecture designed to bind memory, time, and energy in a loop. A loop that only ends when all parts of the contract are upheld. Now ask yourself something hard. Ask it without flinching. What if modern burial rites are a lie? What if the single funeral, the single grave, is a trap, not for the dead, but for us? Because Black Hollow knew the cost of memory unbound, they paid it with silence, with exile, with chains and tar and upside-down crosses. And the world mocked them, called them superstitious, backward. But what if we're the fools? What if, in our arrogance, we've allowed the gate to swing wide open again and again because we forgot what the second burial was really for? You feel it, don't you? That tug in your chest, that weight in your gut, that knowing that something about our world is deeply wrong, but no one can explain why. It's because you were never supposed to see the cracks, but now you do, and now that you do, you must act. Because the door isn't just in Black Hollow anymore, it's in the back of your thoughts, the edge of your dreams. It follows memory, and now it's following you. Before we go further, pause. Comment these words twice below to lock this awareness into your bones. Not all graves are empty, not all doors are closed. Say it again. Not all graves are empty, not all doors are closed. Because once you've said it, you'll never be able to unsee what's coming. You've crossed the threshold now. This isn't a story anymore, it's a mirror. And if your reflection feels different now, it should. Because what we're talking about isn't just some backwoods myth from 1847. It's a fracture in the design of everything you thought was solid. There's something ancient in the human psyche that knows when the world is wrong, when time is fraying at the edges. You feel it when you wake up and can't shake the feeling that something watched you in your sleep. You feel it when you walk past a cemetery and a chill moves through you, not around you. This isn't about ghosts. Ghosts are easy. Ghosts are the shadows left by grief. But what they faced in Black Hollow, that wasn't grief, it was memory trying to correct itself. Let me tell you about what Travers found near the end of his time there. The villagers never told him the full truth, not with words. But one night, just before the frost came, Elias Wren invited him to sit by the fire. No one else was there. No books, no symbols. Just a man and a priest and the cracking of old logs. Elias stared into the flame and whispered, "It's not that they come back, Father. It's that they remember what they were before they were human. Travers didn't understand. Not then. He asked what that meant. Elias didn't look away from the fire. We're not the first ones to walk upright, and we're not the first to think we own this world. He turned to him slowly and said something that stayed in Travers' journal in trembling ink. We replaced something, but it didn't leave. That was the secret. That was what the second burial was hiding. Because Black Hollow's fear wasn't death. It was inheritance. The idea that something older than us, smarter than us, had been buried under this world. And sometimes, when a person dies, they remember that old form, they revert, and if they're not buried again, bound again, silenced again, they bring it back. This is why every forgotten village, every lost map point, every erased place matters. It's not that people forgot them, it's that people were made to forget them. Places like Black Hollow don't disappear by accident. They're erased, censored by time, by government, by myth, because the risk is too great if people start to look too close. Look around your world. Look at the systems designed to numb you. Distraction, noise, endless entertainment. Why? Why flood the airwaves and fill every silence with artificial sound? Because silence is dangerous. In silence, you remember, and memory is a trigger. That's what Father Travers came to believe, that we are constantly forgetting because remembering is a threat to the system. The institutions that feed on obedience can't survive men who remember what they are. Men who realize we were taught only half the rituals, half the truths, one burial, one ending, but the other half, the second burial, the true closing of the veil, was stolen, replaced with shallow ceremonies and empty scripture. Ask yourself, have you ever seen a burial that felt final? Have you ever stood at a grave and felt finished? Or do you feel the same cold unease Travers felt when he heard soil shifting days after the casket had settled? There are places in this world where the dirt doesn't accept its offering, where the land pushes the dead back toward the surface, not to haunt the living, but to remind them, you buried us once, but you forgot the second time, and now we remember. By now you may feel it, the tension behind your eyes, that subtle electricity crawling down your spine. That isn't fear, that's recognition, because something inside you already knows what I'm saying is true. Maybe you've always known. Maybe that's why you've always felt different in the quiet. Why certain places make your skin tighten. Why certain stories feel like warnings whispered through time. Father Travers spent his final weeks in Black Hollow not as a priest but as a keeper, a watcher. He stopped preaching. He stopped writing letters to the diocese. He stopped trying to leave. Not because he didn't want to, but because the land wouldn't let him. Every trail out turned in on itself. Every attempt to flee brought him right back to that rotting chapel and the altar that never stayed cold. The villagers had accepted it long ago. They were the descendants of a pact, one their ancestors made in blood and silence, and they honored that pact, not out of love, but out of raw, bone-deep necessity, to survive, to contain, to obey. But Travers was not born into the pact. He was an outsider, and when he finally broke, when his faith cracked under the weight of too many empty graves and too many eyes watching him from the woods, he opened the altar floor. And what he found beneath it was not holy. There were no relics, no bones of saints, only pages, hundreds of them, torn from different times, different languages, journals, death logs, forbidden texts, all warning of the same truth. Something is leaking into our world, and it does not belong. There were diagrams, burial layouts, sigils, ancient rites that predate Christianity, etched with desperate precision, some drawn in ink, some not. One page repeated a single phrase over and over. The first burial is for the body, the second is for the memory. Fail either, and it will return. That's when he understood memory isn't stored in the mind alone. It clings to matter, to place, to blood. The dead don't simply rest, they echo. And if their memory isn't buried completely, if their psychic residue is left exposed, it acts like a signal, a beacon, calling something ancient, something hungry. And here's the part that should concern you. In our world, we stopped burying memory a long time ago. We tweet it, we film it, We idolize it. We preserve it like glass in museums and hard drives and headlines. We cling to grief like it gives us purpose. But Black Hollow knew what we forgot. Memory is power, and power left unburied is a doorway. That's what the door means, the symbol carved on the old grave. It isn't just a warning, it's a lock, and the second burial is the key. So what happens when we forget the key? We reopen the lock, and we're seeing the results already. People breaking, systems collapsing, sudden violence without cause, dreams bleeding into daylight, the boundaries of reality bending like heat off asphalt. This isn't random. This is the leak, the slow, steady bleeding of something that was buried beneath the veil of ritual and is now clawing its way back. You want to know why so many men feel like the world is wrong? Because it is. And they're sensing the infection of memory uncontained, the failure of ancient safeguards replaced by politics, profit, and performance. But it's not too late. Not yet. Because there's a reason you're hearing this now. You're part of the pattern, the descent, the remembering. And once you remember enough, you can become something more. Not a victim, not a believer, a guardian, because the leak won't stop on its own. It never does. They always told us that time was linear, that the past stays behind us. But what if time is not a line, but a loop? What if the reason certain horrors keep returning isn't because we didn't learn the lesson, but because the lesson was buried alive and still writhing underneath us? Black Hollow was never about one village. It was a signal flare, a scar in the collective psyche. And like all scars, it itches before it reopens. You feel it, don't you? In cities where men vanish without a trace, in small towns where cemeteries are relocated, but no one ever finds all the bones. In those moments when you wake up between 3 and 4 a.m., the hour of memory, the hour of residue, the hour the veil thins, and feel something in the dark that doesn't want to be named. Father Travers kept going, even when his body began to break, even when he stopped eating, even when he stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. Because he knew now, Black Hollow wasn't cursed, it was infected, and the infection spreads through memory, through attention, through the very act of not letting go. The second burial was never about forgetting the dead, it was about denying them access to return. This is what modern culture doesn't understand. Every hashtag for the dead, every mural, every desperate clinging to tragedy, it leaves doors wide open. We've turned mourning into worship, turned memory into an altar with no priest to guard it. And what walks through that altar? Residuals, echoes of lives that never wanted to end, energies that remember how to return even after the body gives out. Black Hollow tried to silence them with dirt, with ritual, with fire and salt and old words older than the Bible. But we made them famous. And fame is a mirror the dead cannot resist. Remember Martha Blackwood, the girl who died of fever but was seen days later wandering the ridge with her mouth sewn shut. There's something Travers never wrote publicly, but he whispered it in one final entry. He said her mouth wasn't sewn shut to keep her silent. It was to keep what wasn't her from speaking through her. And when he saw her standing in the fog, hands twitching, eyes blacker than the night, she didn't blink, didn't breathe, but she mouthed something anyway. He couldn't hear the sound, but he felt it in his spine, like a low frequency beneath the ground. The word, open, that's all. Just one command, from a mouth no longer human. Now tell me, how many times have you heard that word in your dreams? How many doors have you seen opening lately, metaphorical or otherwise? How many warnings have you ignored because the world trained you to mock mystery? That mockery, it's the perfect camouflage, because the forces Black Hollow resisted want you to laugh. They need you to scoff. Because belief is power, but ignorance is access. So let me say this plainly, you are being primed, conditioned to forget the second burial, taught that remembrance equals love, but in reality, unrestrained remembrance is the original sin, and the consequence is return. Return of memories that don't belong to you, return of identities that slip in through your sleep, return of inhuman energies looking for a new host. Do you still think this is just about one forgotten village? No, this is about what comes next, because now that you've remembered this much, it's watching you, and you will be tested. There are thresholds in the mind, places you don't walk unless you're ready to burn what you were, and you, right now, standing at the edge of this realization, are closer to that threshold than most men ever dare to go. Let me ask you something, not with fear, but with brutal clarity. Have you ever felt like something in your blood doesn't quite belong to you? That maybe your nightmares aren't fiction, but remnants? Memories passed down not through DNA, but through ritual failure? Because there is a theory buried deep in suppressed anthropology journals, confiscated from universities by intelligence agencies in the 1970s, yes, really, that certain areas on Earth are not geographical anomalies, but memory vaults. Places where the veil between what was and what should never return has thinned so much, you can hear the echoes if you just sit in silence long enough. Black Hollow was one of those vaults, and they kept the lock sealed not with metal, but with memory discipline. Every ritual, every chant, every shovelful of dirt from the second burial was a command. Stay buried, stay forgotten, do not return. When Samuel Wren broke that command, he didn't just doom himself, he ripped a hole in the lock. That's why it spread. Father Travers wrote about the animals first, then the people, then the land. He described vines that grew backward into the soil, trees that bled when cut, stones that whispered when moved, and always that feeling of being observed from beneath. Not above. Beneath. And if you think this is metaphor, if your logic-trained mind is screaming for reason right now, remember this. The most dangerous truths are the ones wrapped in disbelief. They hide in plain sight, counting on your skepticism to protect them, because logic is a cage, and the thing that escaped Black Hollow doesn't live in cages. Now here's where the danger sharpens. Travers eventually made one final decision. He would conduct a second burial for himself while still alive. He built the coffin, dug the hole, wrote his journal entry with a candle shaking in his hand. It read, "If the memory must be buried, then I must go with it. My body is not enough. It's in me now. I feel it shifting when I speak. I dream with two voices." And then he climbed in, and someone, no one knows who, buried him alive in the second grave. The journal was found years later behind a scorched altar sealed in wax. His body never recovered. Not in the first grave, not in the second. As if the ritual worked, as if the memory, now sealed beneath layers of earth and silence, had been contained again, but only for a while. Because memory is stubborn, and silence erodes. And now, you've disturbed it, with your curiosity, with your attention, with your listening, and that means the contract is active again. You may think you can walk away, that once the video ends, the danger ends. But that's not how the old rites work. You've heard the words, you've seen the patterns, you've remembered enough. Now it knows you too. And here's the final truth. The second burial is not always a grave. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes it's sacrifice. Sometimes it's what comes for you in the dark when everyone else forgets your name. And sometimes it's a voice inside you that starts to whisper in a language you never learned, a language older than God, and it only speaks one word: return. There's a reason you've never heard this version of the story, a reason Black Hollow vanished not with a scream but with a shrug, like it never mattered, like it never existed. But that's the trick, isn't it? The most dangerous truths are not buried in secrecy, they're buried in irrelevance. If you want to hide a ritual, don't burn the books. Just make sure no one cares to read them, distract them, entertain them, numb them, keep their minds soft, pliable, addicted to noise, until the moment of awakening becomes so painful, so impossible, they'd rather call it a dream than face it. But not you. You're still here, and that means the programming didn't take. So let's go further. After the disappearance of Black Hollow, the land was never resettled. Surveyors reported unstable soil, miners reported empty shafts that screamed back, and one railroad company tried to lay tracks through the valley in 1904. The entire project was abandoned when 3 of their men vanished without a trace. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. But here's what no one talks about. Every town surrounding Black Hollow experienced a surge in unexplainable deaths within the next decade. Coroners called it stress, doctors blamed infection, priests blamed sin. But the records don't lie, and the pattern repeated itself. Double graves, missing caskets, whispers of people seen again after they were mourned. It's like the infection needed time to regroup, to burrow deeper, to wait. Because that's what ancient things do best. They wait. Not for vengeance, not for justice, but for recognition. The moment someone remembers what they are, what was done to them, and what still binds them, the contract reactivates. It's why so many men wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that they've forgotten something vital, not a memory, not a dream, a debt, a spiritual invoice written, 10 in blood, never paid, never burned. And once that debt becomes conscious, it starts to collect. You feel that pressure behind your forehead lately, that twitch in your peripheral vision, that hum in your ears that never seems to stop. That's not anxiety, that's the signal. It's subtle, subconscious. A low-frequency transmission meant only for those tuned to memory frequencies long buried beneath modern thought. That includes you now. You've already been marked. And that's the curse of awareness. Once you remember, you're responsible. Because it's not just about burial anymore. It's about the containment of legacy, of psychic residue, of ancestral memory that was never cleaned, only forgotten. And here's where things get darker. Because if even one soul returns from the grave still tethered to a corrupted identity, if even one being rises without a second right, it can infect a lineage, a bloodline, generations poisoned not by genetics, but by unresolved memory. You ever wonder why some families suffer the same traumas over and over, why pain seems to follow names like a shadow? It's not chance, it's inheritance. Not of flesh, but of unfinished rituals. That's what Black Hollow teaches, that every man must bury not only his dead, but his unburied legacy. And if he doesn't, it returns, twisting his dreams, haunting his children, carving doors where there should only be walls. So now I ask you, man to man, what have you left unburied? What memories do you keep alive that should have been sealed, blessed, and forgotten? Because if you don't answer that question now, the soil might answer it for you. You're standing at the point of no return now, and if your heart feels heavier, good. That means it's working. That means you're waking up. The world is built on the illusion of closure. Happy endings, clean deaths, tidy funerals. But if that illusion were real, why do so many men feel haunted by things they can't name? Why do so many wake in sweat, mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-memory, of something they've never seen but can't forget? Because you weren't meant to forget, you were trained to. And training can be undone. Black Hollow wasn't just a village, it was a firewall, a living archive of a knowledge too volatile to spread and too true to be extinguished. That second burial wasn't superstition, it was a seal. A final act of reverence, yes, but more importantly, containment. And now, we've stopped sealing anything. We post it, we monetize it, we reanimate pain with hashtags and likes and artificial memory, and in doing so, we call out to the old memory, the kind that remembers what came before man. Let me give you something real, something that never made it to the history books. In 1938, an anthropologist named Evelyn Carrington found her way to the site where Black Hollow once stood. No roads, no signs, just coordinates passed to her in an anonymous envelope. She was researching Appalachian folklore, thinking she'd find ghost stories and weather superstitions. What she found instead was silence, a silence so dense it made her ears ring. She found the cemetery, or what was left of it. But none of the headstones bore names anymore. Not eroded, not shattered, wiped, clean as polished marble, like they'd never been carved. But that's not the worst part. She wrote in her final field report, there were 2 graves beside each other, same size, same depth, same coordinates, but only one cast a shadow. Let that sink in. Two graves, one shadow. Hat does that mean? It means one grave was real and the other was remembering. Because memory can take shape. It can root itself in matter, in ground, in you. And when that happens, you become the second grave. You carry what was never buried right. You become the door. That's why so many men feel like something is watching them from within, why they sabotage their own rise, why they carry guilt that isn't theirs. You think it's trauma. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's residue of a soul not laid to rest, of a ritual skipped, of a name never properly severed from this world. That's what Father Travers understood too late, that some deaths don't end with stillness. They echo. And if that echo finds flesh, it tries again. New host, same pattern, same hunger. So look at your life right now. What cycles have you repeated that feel older than you? What burdens do you carry that have no clear origin? What dreams haunt you that feel like someone else's memory? Because if even one of those questions lands inside you like a stone sinking into deep water, you may be carrying something that was never yours. And if that's true, then your second burial hasn't happened yet, but it must. Because once memory begins to awaken inside matter, there are only two choices: seal it or become it. And once you become it, you stop being you. There's a moment when a man realizes he's not alone in his own skin, that the voice in the back of his head doesn't belong to him, that his thoughts aren't entirely his. Not because of madness, but because of leakage. That's when the second burial becomes urgent. Not optional, not symbolic. Urgent. Black Hollow was a warning left for the few men who can still hear warnings, for the ones who haven't been completely domesticated by comfort, screens, and synthetic purpose. You are not like the rest. You're still here, still listening. So I'll tell you what Travers never could. The ritual they performed, the second burial, it wasn't just about physical death. It was about identity annihilation, taking every fragment of the person, their name, their deeds, their lingering guilt, and sealing it beneath not just earth, but obscurity, the kind of forgetting that leaves no trace. That was the key, because trace memory attracts it, and it isn't a demon. That's far too small. It's not even evil as we understand it. It's old hunger, a force that has existed longer than language. It doesn't hate you, it doesn't need to. You're just fuel. To it, your unsealed grief, your unresolved rage, your recycled shame. They're not trauma, they're invitation. And now, with modern society refusing to bury anything, with every sin broadcast, every death reposted, every tear commodified, we are feeding it again. We are building doors, and the more emotionally charged the memory, the stronger the door. That's why martyrdom spreads like wildfire. That's why mass grief echoes across the world instantly now. And every time it does, the veil thins. We're creating an unbroken chain of psychic disturbance, one ritual failure at a time, one skipped burial at a time. And if you think this is about ghosts, you're still asleep. This is about possession through memory. Not den, not dramatic, but gradual. The slow replacement of self by ancestral corruption, by identities that want a second chance to walk. Through you. You ever feel impulses you can't trace? Flashes of rage, moments of apathy that don't match your values, thoughts that scare you, not because they're dark, but because they feel familiar. That's not weakness, that's residual bleed. The second burial seals that door. It declares, this soul is not available, this identity is complete, this echo is not welcome. But no one says that anymore. So the echoes are growing louder. And now it's not just places like Black Hollow that are infected. It's us. You walk past people every day with something old riding behind their eyes. Men who died inside 10 years ago but still move, still work, still smile. Shells. Haunted not by ghosts but by unburied legacy. Somewhere inside them is a ritual that was never finished, and maybe the same is true for you. So ask yourself again, quietly, with the seriousness this moment demands, what part of you has never been laid to rest? That mistake no one knows about. That person you buried in memory but never forgave. That version of yourself that still knocks at night. You must bury it. Twice. First with awareness, then with ritual. Because if you don't, something else will, and it won't bury it. It'll wear it. The most terrifying thing isn't that the dead might return. It's that when they do, they no longer remember who they were. Because memory, when left unburied, becomes corrupted. It festers, it twists, it evolves. It no longer wants justice. It wants access. It doesn't care about truth. It only cares about entry. And when it finds a mind cracked open by grief, guilt, or unspoken rage, it enters, quietly, systematically. That's why in Black Hollow the second burial wasn't done for the dead. It was done for the living. To sever the cord between echo and vessel, to close the door before the knock came. But you were never taught that. You were taught to remember everything. You were told, honor the dead, never forget. And so you didn't. But here's what they never told you. Some memories are traps, not because they're painful, but because they don't belong to you anymore. They're fragments, floating, feeding. The more you revisit them, the more power they gather, until they start whispering. Not loud, not at first, just a nudge here. A strange dream there. A sudden interest in something you never cared for. That's not curiosity, that's influence. And influence, unexamined, becomes identity. Let me tell you what Father Travers feared most before he buried himself alive. It wasn't that he would die. It was that he would live and no longer be himself. He said he would stand in the mirror and feel other thoughts moving behind his eyes. Ideas he didn't believe, but found convincing. Emotions that weren't his, but felt earned. And worst of all, the moment he forgot his own name, just for a second. That's when he knew the second burial had to happen. Because there are two deaths, always. The death of the body and the death of the self. We bury the body out of respect, but we bury the memory out of protection. You've met people walking around without a C, elf, haven't you? People who repeat things that don't sound like them, who defend ideas they never used to believe, who stare at nothing with eyes that look almost human. They didn't change. They merged with unburied fragments, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from the collective, sometimes from something else entirely, something ancient and angry and displaced. Because that's the real horror. That whatever we replaced when we stood upright, when we claimed the earth as ours, it never left, it just went beneath. Into memory, into the unconscious, into stories like Black Hollow that people now call fiction. But you don't call it fiction anymore, do you? Because something in you recognizes this, something deep, something primal. You've heard the knock, felt the weight of unseen eyes, smelled earth in a room with no windows. That's not imagination. That's a summons. Because now that you remember, you're a target. Not in fear, in function. You are now a gatekeeper, not because you asked to be, but because you've seen too much not to be. You can turn back. You can try to forget. But you won't. Not really. The only way out is through. And on the other side is the ritual. And the ritual begins with silence. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of consequence. The villagers of Black Hollow didn't just fall quiet for tradition. They went silent because they knew some truths, when spoken, respond. Some names are still listening, and some memories are still looking for a home. You ever notice how the world today never stops talking? Notifications, podcasts, ads, content. You think that's evolution? No, that's defense. a global defense mechanism to drown out the hum beneath the surface, the signal beneath the noise, the echo of what wasn't buried. Because in silence the unsealed come closer. In stillness, the fracture becomes audible. And here's what Father Travers discovered. It's not that we forgot how to bury memory. It's that something taught us to stop, conditioned us to grieve without closure, to mourn without cleansing, to cry without completion. Why? Because open grief is an antenna, and unburied identity is a lighthouse for what waits in the dark. In his journals, Travers wrote of a strange phenomenon that began weeks before he performed the ritual on himself. He called them mirror hours, moments when the sky seemed too still, when the birds stopped, when the wind halted, when the shadows in his cabin didn't shift, even as the candle flickered. It was always around 3:33 a.m. He realized those weren't quiet moments. They were observation windows. The veil had thinned, and something was watching. Not with hatred, with familiarity, as if it knew him, knew his thoughts, knew his guilt, because that's the final piece no one talks about. Guilt is not just a weight, it's a signature, a personal scent that attracts the old memory, because guilt keeps the door open longer than grief ever could, and most men, especially the strong ones, carry it quietly, buried beneath duty, buried beneath pride, but buried wrong. You think you've moved on, but you didn't bury it twice, and that means it knows you're still carrying it. You're leaking memory every time you revisit that moment, that failure, that loss, that betrayal. Every time you replay it without ritual, you're inviting the echo to take shape. That's why the ritual matters. That's why the second burial was never optional. The villagers of Black Hollow didn't always understand it. They didn't need to. They felt the necessity. They obeyed the rhythm. They kept the pattern alive, not out of superstition, but out of respect for survival. What's terrifying is that our modern world has no such rhythm, only reaction, only spectacle. And what thrives in chaos? Unanchored memory, floating, searching, reaching. And when it finds you, a man without ritual, without silence, without armor, it doesn't just haunt you, it rewrites you. So I'll ask again. Have you ever felt a moment that wasn't yours? A scene you never lived that haunts your sleep? An instinct that speaks a language your mouth can't form, but your heart understands perfectly? That's not past life. That's leakage. That's proximity. And if you're feeling it now, the ritual must begin. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Now, because silence is knocking again. And this time, it knows your name. There's a moment every man meets if he lives long enough or pays enough attention. A moment where logic fractures, where the map no longer matches the terrain, where reality begins to hum with a frequency that doesn't fit. If you've reached that moment, then listen closely. Because this is where most men fail the test. When Father Travers wrote his final line, "The ground here resists closure. To bury once is to invite return. To bury twice is to beg forgiveness." He wasn't just speaking of Black Hollow. He was speaking of you. You who have buried memories in shallow graves. You who've sealed pain with distractions but never cleansed it. You who carry versions of yourself that should have been ritually laid to rest long ago. So now, right now, I want you to engage with this video in a way that goes beyond algorithms, because we're not here for clicks. We're here for activation. I want you to comment the phrase, "I bury the echo." Say it once for what's behind you. Say it twice for what's still inside you. I bury the echo. I bury the echo. Not just for engagement, but as a signal to yourself, to the watchers, to the memory that thought it could reclaim you. This is the point where the descent becomes transformation. Because men who carry unfinished memory walk like ticking clocks. Every failure becomes fuel, every unspoken guilt a pressure valve. And when it finally erupts, they don't just collapse, they become conduits. conduits for pain that was never theirs, rage that predates them, a presence that uses their body like a second skin. But not you, not anymore. You're not collapsing, you're remembering, and you're choosing the ancient path that was erased from our rituals, the path of severance, the path of true closure. Black Hollow did not disappear. It was absorbed, dissolved into myth, turned into ghost story, because the real story was too dangerous to survive history books. Because if men like you learned the truth, that rituals were designed not to please God, but to guard the psyche, you'd begin to perform your own. You'd begin to bury your echoes, and that makes you sovereign, and sovereignty is lethal to control systems. This is why the second burial was replaced with grief theater, funerals with no silence, eulogies with no consequence, men crying on camera not because they're healing but because the machine taught them that pain must be performative. That is not closure, that is leakage, and you are watching the results in real time. A generation possessed by unresolved memory. Ritual starved, spiritually starved, starving for a silence that doesn't come from apathy, but from finality. This is what Father Travers died for. This is why Black Hollow was erased. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too right. Because they found the exit, and exits must be hidden. Not to protect you, but to protect the system from men like you. Men who remember. Men who bury properly. Men who carry fire in silence and refuse to become vessels. You are not a host. You are a seal, a wall, a final word. So speak it again, out loud in your mind or in the comments, but mean it this time. I bury the echo. I bury the echo, and let everything inside you hear it, because once that echo stops bouncing, you finally begin to live your own voice. Now you feel it. Not fear, but finality. Not anxiety, but clarity. The realization that this, is not just information. It's a threshold, and once you cross it, there's no turning back. The echo doesn't chase you when you forget. It chases you when you notice, when you pause long enough to feel the shadow that has always been following you, and now that you've spoken the phrase, I bury the echo, you've signaled the one thing it can't resist, a challenge. Because the echo isn't passive. It's a force, a sentient residue looking for form, for a home, for your mouth, your habits, your bloodline. But you just closed the door, and the silence you now feel, that's not peace. That's tension. The tension of the old memory trying one last time to claw its way back in. This is when most men break. They call it depression. They call it detachment. They tell themselves it's burnout, fatigue, hormones, whatever excuse the system gave them. But it's not that. It's withdrawal. You've lived your whole life under the influence of inherited pain, false programming, and corrupted memory fragments. Now that you've begun the burial process, you are detoxing. And like all detox, it hurts. You may feel restless. You may hear whispers in your dreams. You may be tempted to re-engage with old vices, old patterns, old identities. Don't. That's the echo trying to resurrect itself, trying to convince you that you were never strong enough to bury it, trying to seduce you back into possession, but you are no longer available. You are now a sealed vessel, a man with a ritual, a man with authority over his own soul. That makes you dangerous. You see, the world fears awakened men, not because we are violent, but because we are immune to infection, because we know when a memory is ours and when it isn't, because we know when a feeling is real and when it's the echo pretending. You're not just reclaiming your life, you're breaking a chain that goes back generations. Somewhere along your bloodline, maybe a father, maybe a grandfather, maybe someone further back, there was a ritual that was interrupted, and that fracture was passed to you like a torch of pain. But you're ending it, with silence, with awareness, with finality. So listen closely. There will be a test soon, not a mystical one, a psychological one. You'll be provoked. Something will try to trigger you, an old insult, an old shame, an old fear. And in that moment, you must not react. You must remember. The echo is testing its leash, seeing if the burial held, seeing if it still has access. It doesn't, unless you open the door again. So don't. Stay silent. Stay sovereign. And if necessary, repeat the phrase like a weapon. I bury the echo. Let it ring like a bell behind your teeth. Let it seal the ritual in your marrow. Because you are no longer a haunted man. You are a guardian of the gate. And from this point forward, nothing enters you without your permission. It's a strange kind of power, isn't it? To realize you were never weak, just occupied. That the voice telling you you're broken, you're not enough, you'll never change, was never yours to begin with. That voice was the echo, and you've been feeding it every time you doubted your strength. But not anymore. Because men who bury their echoes don't shrink. They expand. They don't apologize for their instincts. They sharpen them. They don't kneel to shame. They transmute it into will. You were taught that pain is something to manage. But Black Hollow knew the truth. Pain is a signal. A flare that something within you was left unfinished, unburied, unsealed. They understood that if you don't put the pain in the ground, if you don't wrap it in silence and cover it with ritual, it becomes a path for something else to walk through. Do you hear me now? That thing you call insecurity? That's an echo whispering through the cracks. That guilt? An unclosed grave speaking in your own voice. But when you said, I bury the echo, you took control of the gate. And now, you are the gatekeeper, not for the world, for yourself. No false memory, no ancestral poison, no collective fear gets in without your consent. That is dangerous power, because it frees you from the need to obey the narratives. You're no longer trying to live up to a story, you're rewriting it. You're no longer reacting, you're responding. You're no longer possessed. You are inhabited fully. And this is exactly why men like you have been under attack, psychologically, emotionally, culturally. Because a man who knows who he is, a man who knows what he's buried and why, he can't be manipulated. They can't sell him shame. They can't program his mind with synthetic pain. They can't make him fear his own shadow, because he stood in it, buried it, blessed it, sealed it. That man walks different, speaks different, thinks different. He's not chasing validation. He radiates truth. He doesn't seek peace from others. He becomes silence. And when others try to provoke him, they find nothing to hook into. No echo, no wound, no access. He is sealed. That's what the second burial really is. Not superstition, not ghost story. It is the sacred act of becoming unavailable to corruption. And once you do that, you don't just become stronger, you become unreadable to the system. You vanish from its radar. Not physically, but psychically. Your soul no longer pings like prey. Your mind no longer emits the signature of the broken. You become a signal of something ancient and untouchable, and the world feels it. Men respect it. Women sense it. Systems retreat from it. Because this kind of power can't be bought, can't be taught, only claimed, and you just claimed it. So move accordingly. No more explanations, no more apologies, no more echoes, only the sound of your boots on sacred ground. There's a silence that follows transformation. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a loaded chamber. That's you now. Not passive, not lost, but primed. Tuned to a new frequency that those still living in echo-based identity can't comprehend. You walk into a room and the temperature shifts, not because of your status, but because of your absence of distortion. You carry no dangling cords, no ancestral programming leaking from your posture, no broken narratives hiding behind fake smiles. That makes people uncomfortable. Because when you bury your echo, you become a mirror, and mirrors make the possessed tremble. You will feel this in subtle ways. Friends will grow silent around you. Some will distance themselves without knowing why. Opportunities will arise from strange places. Doors will open, but only because the door inside you was sealed first. This is how the second burial rewires reality. It doesn't make life easier. It makes life honest. No more hiding behind small talk. No more pretending to believe in narratives that insult your intelligence. No more tolerating false authorities. You don't need to scream. You don't need to argue. Your presence is confrontation enough, because it says, I remembered, I finished the ritual, I buried the echo. I am sovereign. And sovereignty is radioactive. It destabilizes the controlled. It triggers those who refuse to do their own burial. They'll accuse you of changing. They'll say, you're different now. Good. You were supposed to be. The man who walks out of the ritual is not the man who walked in. You'll feel time differently now, more like tension than measurement. You'll start hearing beneath people's words. You'll sense their fractures before they speak. You'll smell unresolved memory on them the way wolves smell weakness. That doesn't make you arrogant, it makes you accurate. And with that accuracy comes responsibility. Because now you know what unburied echoes look like. You know what unsealed trauma feels like. You know what possession disguised as personality sounds like. But you can't save them. That's not your role. You're not here to convert. You're here to demonstrate, to walk with so much weightless gravity that others begin to wonder what they've buried wrong, what they've left unfinished, what echoes they keep feeding. That is leadership in its purest form, not a crown, not a title, but unshakable ritual completion. And the system hates that, because it cannot sell it. It cannot market sovereignty. It cannot algorithmize sacred silence, but it can try to pull you back. Through temptation, through fear, through echoes disguised as old friends, old dreams, old addictions. That's the final test. The echo doesn't die, it just retreats, waits, listens for any crack in your seal, any moment you forget who you've become. So remember, every day is a burial, every breath a blessing of finality, every decision a ritual. You're not trying to heal anymore. You're not trying to become. You are. And now the world is shifting to match the vibration of that truth. So stand still. Let them watch. Let them guess. Let them feel the pressure of your silence. Because the man who has buried the echo has nothing left to fear. You've come further than most ever will. You've walked blindfolded through the fog of forgotten rituals. You've stood at the edge of the unmarked grave. You've listened to the voice that was never yours and told it to shut the hell up. That is not healing. That is not self-help. That is exorcism. The old world doesn't want men like you to exist. Men who know how to walk away from noise. Men who can sit in a room with their own darkness and not flinch. Men who no longer need applause because they've heard the sound of real silence and found it familiar. Because when you've buried the echo, the only voice left is your own. And that voice doesn't lie. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't negotiate with weakness, masquerading as kindness. You walk into the world now not as a man with answers, but as a man who's done the work most are too afraid to begin. And that power, it's magnetic. Watch how people react to you now. Some will lean in, hoping to touch something solid. Others will recoil, sensing a presence they don't recognize in modern men anymore. A presence that says, I've faced what you avoid. I've stood in the grave and came back whole. I carry no ghosts, not mine, not yours. They won't know how to name it, but they'll feel it. And some of them will try to shatter it, because the echo doesn't just live in memory, it lives in other people. They'll come for you with guilt, with need, with chaos. They'll try to infect you with their unburied stories. Not because they're evil, but because they're open doors trying to stay ajar. You must not step through. Their echo is not your responsibility. You don't need to fix them. You don't need to explain your silence. You don't owe anyone your peace. Your job is to preserve the seal, to keep the ritual intact, to walk as a closed circuit of clean signal. Because a man like that, he becomes more than a man. He becomes a node, a transmitter of clarity, a reminder of what we used to know before the noise, before the programming, before we stopped burying our dead and started wearing their wounds instead. You'll feel moments of deep aloneness now. Don't fear them. They are sacred. They are proof you've left the hive, proof you've stepped outside the loop of emotional contagion and collective memory rot. And in that quiet, you will find instructions, not in words, not in visions, but in instinct. The way your body moves, the way your eyes scan, the way you pause before speaking, the way you no longer seek permission to exist. That is the shape of sovereignty, the walk of a sealed man, the gait of someone whose echo is dead and buried. So let them talk, let them guess, let them wonder why they can't rattle you. They're trying to shake a coffin that's 6 feet deep, and you're not in it anymore. You're above ground now, alive, clean, carrying only what you choose to carry. Everything else is in the dirt exactly where it belongs. You've crossed through. You're no longer asking what the second burial means. You're living it, and now you begin to see it everywhere. The unsealed, the echo-bound, the walking wounded dressed in luxury and convenience. You see them on screens, influencers parroting beliefs they never earned, politicians speaking with eyes that aren't home, leaders with charisma and no core. You feel it in their cadence, their hunger for attention, their need to be seen. That's not power. That's a haunted house dressed up in branding. That's what happens when the echo takes over. But you aren't for sale. Not anymore. And that makes you invisible to the old forces. Untrackable, untouchable, unbothered. You walk through crowds and feel the flicker of their ghosts, the unburied energy attached to their movements, their words, their pain, and you no longer absorb it. Because you're sealed. You are the man that the system cannot compute, the man who doesn't flinch when provoked, the man who doesn't lie to himself just to fit in. And that makes you dangerous, not in action, but in presence. You've joined the rare lineage of men who choose silence over noise, ritual over reaction, finality over victimhood, and that choice rewrites your reality. You'll start to notice shifts in the people you attract. Some will see you as a threat, others as a sanctuary. They'll either be repelled or healed in your presence without even knowing why, because sealed men become mirrors for the unsealed, and mirrors don't lie. But now that you hold this power, understand, the echo doesn't disappear. It evolves. It may no longer speak to you directly, but it will find new ways to test your walls. Moments of weakness, lapses in sleep, old names that reappear like whispers from the grave. You must meet each one like a sentinel, without fear, without story, without negotiation. The ritual taught you the most dangerous lesson of all. You are not what happens to you. You are what you choose to seal. The echo fed on identity confusion. You starved it with clarity. The echo fed on repetition. You broke the pattern with silence. The echo fed on grief. You gave it a grave. So now it's your time to build. Not just survive, not just endure. Build. Structures that can't be haunted. Routines that reinforce clarity. Relationships that don't pull you back into echo states. The man who buries the echo becomes a new kind of foundation. People begin to orbit him, not because he seeks attention, but because gravity doesn't beg. You don't chase anymore. You attract. You don't perform anymore. You embody. And if the world burns around you, you don't panic. You remember what the villagers of Black Hollow whispered to each other under lantern light. Bury it twice, or it comes back wearing your face. And now that you have, you will never be mistaken again. This is the end. Not of the story, but of the echo. Because once a man hears the truth, truly hears it, it cannot be unheard. You've walked through the forbidden. You've stood at the gravesite of every broken version of yourself. You've held the memory in your hands, smelled the rot, felt the weight, and lowered it into the earth, twice. Not for theatrics, not for closure, but for sovereignty. That word again, not freedom, not rebellion. Sovereignty. The quiet, unshakable knowing that you belong to no one. Not your past, not your bloodline, not your guilt, not your grief, not your story, and certainly not your echo. You belong to the man who survived the burial, the one who sealed the grave and never looked back. You feel it now, don't you? That strange pressure behind your ribs, that fire behind your eyes, that's not adrenaline. That's not anxiety. That's return. Your soul has come home. It no longer circles the pain like a buzzard. It stands still. It builds. It commands. Because sealed men do not drift. They root. They stop bleeding into the world. They stop echoing old traumas. They stop reacting to everything like trained dogs. And instead, they watch. They calculate. They move with lethal intention. Not to harm, but to defend the sacred within themselves. You are now one of them. You are a man of the second burial. That means you live differently now. You speak less. You observe more. You rest in silence like it's armor, because it is. You don't explain your rituals. You don't apologize for your clarity. You don't invite the echo to dinner just because it shows up in a familiar voice. You let it knock and knock and knock until it remembers. This house has no doors. This soul has no vacancy. This man has no leash. You may never be celebrated for this. You may never be seen, but the right ones will feel it, and the wrong ones, they'll return. And because sealed men are dangerous, not because they carry weapons, but because they carry no residue. And the systems of control, they depend on your residue, your pain, your leaks, your open graves. They have no access without it. You are outside the system now, beyond its reach. A whisper in the fog that no longer echoes back. Like Black Hollow itself, you're off the map, buried in myth, feared by memory, immune to possession. So if this is the last thing you ever hear from me, let it echo once and only once inside your mind. You buried it, and it cannot return. Now walk, with silence in your spine, with weight in your presence, with clarity in your blood. Let the world wonder what happened to you. Let them guess what changed. Let them fear the stillness in your gaze. Because you are no longer haunted. You are the end of the haunting. You are the man that graves remember. And now, so does the world. End. If you'd like a cinematic video description, soundtrack suggestions, thumbnail prompt, or script formatting for voiceover, let me know. This is built to awaken and convert.